Hey folks, it's Kieran Barker again with the next installment of my set of accessible components based on Dave Rupert's nutrition cards for accessible components. Now, as you can see from this nutrition card, today we're going to be looking at a disclosure or show hide component. Now, just to give you my demo of what that actually is, so I've copied this snippet here from the actual ARIA authoring practices. A disclosure is a widget that enables content to be either collapsed, hidden, or expanded, visible. It has two elements, a disclosure button and a section of content whose visibility is controlled by the button. So if I click show, I get the content and the label changes to hide, and then if I click it again, it gets hidden again. So that's what we're going to be building. We're actually going to be building this one together from scratch. So obviously I have built a version of it, but we're going to step through together and look at mainly the JavaScript, but we're going to have a look together and see how to do this. So looking at the requirements here, let's just check. I'll just check through with you and show you that we've met everything we need. So firstly, focus expectations. Trigger has visible keyboard focus state. So we have that. I haven't done much to customize it, but you see there's this blue ring around the button. So that's all good. Trigger has role of button, e.g. button element. So we don't need to actually do anything for that because we are using a native HTML button element. So that's taken care of for us. When content is visible, button has ARIA expanded set to true. When content is hidden, it is set to false. So that's taken care of for us. If you pay close attention to the button and the ARIA expanded attribute on it and the hidden attribute on the paragraph. So right now the content is hidden. So this hidden attribute is set and ARIA expanded is set to false. If I activate it, you see the content is now visible. ARIA expanded is set to true, and that hidden attribute is gone. So I'll just show you both states one more time. So you've got it hidden and then visible. Okay, so that's taken care of for us. Optional, button references the content with ARIA controls. So that means you see our content, let me just make it visible. So you see our content has this ID of content. So the ARIA controls attribute has that same value, content, so it sort of links them together. So that's very nice. And then the keyboard expectations, pressing enter or space should toggle the content. So you can't see this, but if I tab to it, if I press space, it works. And if I now press enter instead, that works. So very nice. So that's what we're going to be building. One thing I will mention is we're going to be building this with progressive enhancement in mind. So basically, if the JavaScript fails to load for whatever reason, we're not going to bother with the component at all. We're just going to show the content by default. So if I quickly disable JavaScript, so you see now the content is just visible and that button isn't there anymore. We just have the content. But if I re-enable the JavaScript, then we get this button here that controls the content. Now you may ask, why are we bothering to do this? Because surely people don't disable JavaScript, do they? Well, some people do, but that's not the main issue. The main issue is if the JavaScript fails to load for some reason. And there's this really cool website called Everyone Has JavaScript, right? Which kind of, it steps you through the process, and there's all these different things about different reasons for why JavaScript might not load. So I'm not going to read all of these, but your user requests your web app. Has the page loaded yet? If the page hasn't loaded yet, then JavaScript is unavailable. Did the HTTP request for the JavaScript succeed? So as an example here, if they're on a train and the net connection goes away before your JavaScript loads, then there's no JavaScript. Okay, cool. Did the HTTP request for the JavaScript complete? And then the example again here is, how many times have you had a mobile browser hang forever loading a page? And that can be because the JavaScript is so big that it timed out. So I'll leave a link to this, but there's many reasons why JavaScript could fail. So that's why we need to build this with progressive enhancement in mind. So let's close a few things down. Now I'm going to open up the file. So I've made this a more basic version just for the demo purposes. So as you can see, we've got our paragraph. It just says this content is visible by default. We'll use JavaScript to progressively enhance it into a disclosure show/hide component. So that's all we've got on our HTML is the paragraph, obviously the heading, but you've got this paragraph here with the ID of content. Have added some styling. I might touch on this later, but we're mainly going to be focusing on the JavaScript. So let's get straight into it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is opt into strict mode. Now you do that by having this use strict directive right at the top of your script, and it kind of just opts you into a slightly stricter version of JavaScript, which will help you catch some errors if they crop up. I brought up the MDM page just to kind of explain this. So strict mode makes several changes to normal JavaScript semantics. 1, it eliminates some JavaScript silent errors by changing them to throw errors. 2, it fixes mistakes that make it difficult for JavaScript engines to perform optimizations. And then 3, prohibits some syntax likely to be defined in future versions of ECMAScript. So basically just catches some errors that it might otherwise not show, which just helps to make your code more robust, basically. So that's all that is. So we've opted into strict mode. Now I normally divide my scripts up into 3 sections. So you're going to have constants or variables, and then you're going to have your functions, and then you're going to have your, it's where you initialize the code or add any event listeners. So the way I normally do that is I have a couple of blocks. So let's say constants, and then we're going to have another one for functions, and then one more. I normally write it something like inits and event listeners. So again, init being short for like initialize. And then I normally leave 2 spaces between each block, but it doesn't matter, that's just what I do. So the first thing we're going to want to do is get our content. So it's got an ID of, well, content, funnily enough. So we need to select that from our script. So let's say, let's just say get the content. And we're going to go const content equals document query selector. And then we use the pound or hash symbol as an ID selector. That's how you select an ID in CSS. And then we'll get it like that. And if we quickly do console log content in the console, it should show us that paragraph. Cool. So that's working nicely. Now we also, because we're using progressive enhancement, we need to actually create the button element. And I'm going to create a function for that. So let's go function. I'm going to call it create trigger. Now I like to document my functions using something called JSDoc. So I'll write it out first and then I'll explain it. So let's say, well, actually, I'll explain it as I'm going along. So first thing we're going to want is a description of what the function does. So let's just say create the trigger for the content. And then next, you can document any parameters that the function has and also what its return value is. So we're going to say it returns, and then the type of the return value, which is going to be an HTML button element, and then a little description of that. So we'll just say a button element. And now the benefit of doing this, well, there's a couple of benefits, but the main benefit I like it for is now anywhere you reference that function in your editor, if you hover over it, it's going to surface that information. So it says function create trigger, and then it returns an HTML button element, and obviously it says there create the trigger for the content, which is awesome. As for the HTML button element bit, basically anytime you have a button in your HTML, if you select that from the DOM in your JavaScript, it's going to be an instance of the HTML button element interface. I happen to know this already. This is the page about it in the MDM web docs. So the HTML button element interface provides properties and methods for manipulating button elements. So there's a bunch of other ones, like there's a generic element one, there's an HTML element interface, but some elements, such as buttons, have their own specific interface. And for a button, it's going to be HTML button element. That's the type of object that a button element is, basically. But don't worry too much about that. So the first thing we're going to need to do is actually create the button. So let's say create a button element. And now the way we're going to do that is by calling the create element method on the document. So we'll say const button equals document.create element, and then you pass in the tag name. So we'll say button. Now, currently, all that's going to give us is literally an empty button. So it's not going to have any attributes or text or anything. So if I log that out inside this create trigger function, I am going to need to actually call the function. So if I call create trigger, so you see we've just got an empty button, there's nothing on it. Now we need to give that button a type attribute, which is going to be set to the value button. Now there's a couple of different values you can use. You can have a submit button, you can have a reset button, for example. But when you're creating a button that doesn't do anything by default, so we're adding its behavior with JavaScript, weird as it sounds, we actually want to set the type to button. So we're going to do that by setting the type property and setting its value to button. Now the reason I know it has a type property is going back to this HTML button element interface. Under properties, there is a type attribute, as you can see from this little section here. And then the value button is the button does nothing by default. So that's all that is. Next up, we're going to set the text content of the button, so like the button's label. And we know that's going to be show by default. So that's our basic button that we have now. So if we were to log this out, button, and again, if I'll need to call that function, but you see now we've got button, type of button, and the text content is show. Now we know here that we need to set some attributes from the nutrition card. So it says it needs an ARIA expanded and an ARIA controls attribute. So let's set those. So we'll say set the necessary attributes. And we're going to do this using the set attribute method. So we're going to go button, set attribute, and then you pass in the name of the attribute and then what its value should be. So we're going to say ARIA expanded. We're going to have the content hidden by default, so ARIA expanded should be false. And again, just referencing this, when content is visible, ARIA expanded is set to true. When the content is hidden, it's set to false. So that's why it's false, because I want it to be hidden by default. And then we also need the ARIA controls attribute set to the same ID that the content has. So it needs to be content. Now, one quick optimization we can make here, because it's crucial that this ID is identical on the paragraph and the button. So just to avoid repetition and to make our code less error prone, we can create a quick constant for that. So let's just say the ID for the content. Say const content ID is equal to just content. And then now, where we were using it here in our selector string, we're going to use a template string. So we're still going to have our little hash or pound symbol, but then we can insert that content ID, the value of that content ID string. And then the same down here, instead of passing in the string literal, we're just going to use the value of that constant. Just makes our code less error prone that way. So that is very nice. Now the last thing we need to do is just return that button that we've created. So let's say return the button element. And that basically means when you call this function, the button is what it's going to give you back as the return value. So just to show you quickly again, if I call create trigger, you see the value it's given me back here, the return value is that button. So the type is button, aria expanded is set to false, aria controls is content, which is the same ID that the content has, and then the text label is show by default. So that's great, but obviously it's not actually on the page. So we need to insert it sort of between the H1 and the paragraph. We want it to be before the paragraph. Now, a hint there's a method for that. So if I type in mdn, let's see, element before, there's a method we can use. So the element.before method inserts a set of node or DOM string objects in the children just before this element. So basically, it does what it says. It inserts an element before the current element. Now we're going to need to actually create the element first. So up the top here, just above where we're getting the content, let's say create the trigger. And then we'll assign it to another constant. So we'll go const trigger equals create trigger. So now the value of that trigger constant is it's going to be that button that we just saw a second ago. So console log trigger, and if I refresh, that's the value of our trigger constant, is that button itself. A quick side note, the reason why we're seemingly able to call this function before we've actually defined it is because function declarations are what we say is hoisted. So let me look up mdn hoisting for you. Let's see. So JavaScript hoisting refers to the process where the interpreter appears to move the declaration of functions, variables, or classes to the top of their scope prior to execution of the code. Hoisting allows functions to be safely used in code before they are declared. Now note that only works with function declarations, which is this style of writing a function. It wouldn't work if we wrote the function like const, let's just say create trigger 2 equals. So if you're like assigning a function to a variable, the same applies to arrow functions. It doesn't work. If you're using that syntax, you have to define the function first, but if it's a function declaration, which is this format, then it gets hoisted and you can do this. But anyway, now that we have that button, we can insert it into the page. So down here in our inits, let's just say insert the button element. So we'll go content before, and then we'll say trigger, which is the name of the constant. So if I now refresh the page, well, hey, there's our button. It's in the page now. But it doesn't do anything yet. Firstly, there's our nice focus styles. I just customized them slightly. So we can clearly see we've got our focus styles visible. But if I press enter or space, nothing happens. And same if I click it, nothing is actually happening because we need to add the behavior with JavaScript, and we haven't done that yet, which is a problem, obviously. So we should get to that. So, well, I guess firstly, what we want to do is actually hide this content because the button says show, but the content is currently visible, which we don't want it to be. So we can actually do that really easily. Let's just say hide the content, and we can set the hidden property to true. So content.hidden equals true, and that will hide it. Now to show you what that does, you see the content now has this hidden attribute. So the hidden attribute in HTML, I mean, it kind of does what it says on the tin, really. If an element has the attribute, then it hides it, and if it doesn't have the attribute, then it's visible. Now the reason I know you can use this is because if I go, let's see, mdn, I think it's on the element interface. Let me just check. Element, it may be on HTML element, I'm not sure. So these are all the properties we have available to us, and hidden should be one of those. If it's not on this one, then it might be on HTML element instead. Let's see. Yeah, here you go. HTML element dot hidden, a Boolean value indicating if the element is hidden or not. And if I go on that, yeah, I'm not going to get too much into it, but essentially it just adds and removes that hidden attribute. One thing I will say is, like, you'll notice in my code, like, some places I've used a property like type or with like hidden, and other places I've used set attribute. That's purely for browser support. So there's kind of two different ways you could think of this. You could say, well, just use set attribute all the time because it's always going to work, which is fair enough. Just my personal preference. If there is a property, I like to use it. I just think it's more explicit that way. But the reason why I used set attribute for ARIA expanded and ARIA controls, so there are actually properties for these, but they aren't, at least at the time of writing, they're not supported in Firefox. So let me just show you quickly. ARIA expanded. So it's on the element interface, for example. But if I go down to the browser support, you can see there's no support in Firefox, which is why I'm not using it. I'm just using set attribute instead. But anyway, we've inserted the button and our content is hidden. So now we just need to make it so that when you click the button, it will either show or hide the content. Quite simple, really. So we're going to add an event listener to our button. So let's just write, I don't know, handle click events. So we're going to say trigger add event listener, and then the name of the event, which is going to be click, and then we're going to give it a callback function that's going to be run whenever we click on the button. So let's say function, it will get the event, so the add event listener method will pass in the event interface by default. We're not actually going to need it, but just to show, I'm just going to leave it there for now because that technically we do have access to it. I guess maybe I'll just quickly show you that. Console.log event. So now if I click on it, you see it's showing me a pointer event because that's the event that's being fired every time I click on it. So we have access to this event and all the properties on it, but we don't really need it in this case. So let's actually just get rid of it. Okay, so first thing we need to do is get the current expanded state, we'll say, and then 2, show or hide the content. So that's what we need to do. So step 1, get the expanded state. We're just going to get the value of that ARIA expanded attribute. So we can say is expanded equals, and we'll say trigger.get attribute, and then you just give it the name, so ARIA expanded. And just to prove that this works, let's console log the value of it. So every time we click on the button, it should tell us what the value of this attribute is. I mean, we can see here it's false, but let's just test if it works. False. So that's good. And it should also work if I press space or enter, which it does, just because we use the button element, which is great. So we're getting that as a string value now. I guess just to prove that, if I do type of is expanded, it will tell you it's a string. See? So that's great. And then we just need to show or hide the content based on the value. So let's say show or hide the content based on the state. So we'll say if is expanded is equal to true. Note that if this were an actual Boolean value, then we wouldn't need to do this. We could just do that if is expanded, but because it's a string, we need to explicitly check for the string true. So we'll say if is expanded is true, then in that case we want to hide the content, don't we? So let's just say we have a function called hide, and then we'll say else if is expanded is equal to false, then we want to show the content. So if the content is already expanded, then hide it. Otherwise, if the content is not expanded, then show it. And I've kind of used these show and hide functions here, which we are going to create these functions because it makes sense to have a kind of nice, it makes sense for sort of separation of concerns and sort of a function having one job. It makes sense if we have a function that shows and a function that hides. Sorry about that, I was just taking a sip of water. Okay, so above this create trigger function, well, actually no, let's do it below. So let's create a function called show, and we'll add our JS doc again. We'll just write show the content. So again, that's being surfaced here in the editor. So to show the actual content, we just need to, where we set that hidden property to true, we just need to set it to false, and then that will remove the attribute from the HTML. So we'll say content dot hidden equals false. Now that should actually work sort of now. So if I click on that, oh wait, sorry, do I need to? Oh, it's because it's commented out. Let's uncomment it now. So if I click on that, content's now visible, but I'm not going to be able to close it again because we haven't done that yet. But you can see that the attribute, that hidden attribute, gets removed. So that's awesome. So we also need to adjust the button though, don't we? Because right now the button isn't changing, it still says show. So we're going to want to say, let's say, update the trigger. Now we're going to update the text content to say hide. So let's show you that quickly. Boom, it says hide, but we also need to change the value of this aria expanded attribute, don't we? Because the nutrition card said when content is visible, aria expanded should be true. And right now we don't have that, it stays false. So we're also going to want to say trigger.set attribute aria expanded and then the value true. And now our show functionality should work. So if I click show, boom, and you'll see the arrow also changed. I have some clever CSS to do that. I might touch on that shortly. But that's working now. And as for our hide function, it's basically just the opposite of this. So I'm just pretty much going to copy and paste this. So we'll say hide the content. We'll call it hide instead. Hide the content. So we actually want to set hidden to true in that case. And then the label should be show. And then the value should be false. And now if I uncomment that, it should work both ways. Let's see. Boom. So you can see the aria expanded attribute, the value is changing, and the button's label is changing. And this hidden attribute is being added and removed from the paragraph, which is very cool. So that's virtually it. I am going to touch on this arrow here that I'm doing because I'm quite happy with that. It's pretty clever. So it's done with a pseudo element. I'm actually just going to go and edit my CSS here. So it's done using the before pseudo element, and I'm just inserting some blank content, setting its width and height and giving it a background color. So basically that just inserts a square as a pseudo element here inside the button. So it's not actually in the HTML, so the content is inserted via CSS using this before pseudo element. Just to show you quickly, MDN before pseudo element. So yeah, in CSS, before creates a pseudo element that is the first child of the selected element. It's often used to add cosmetic content to an element with the content property. Now, something interesting to mention So you can actually just insert the content that you want inside this content property. Now, originally, I was actually inserting the triangles manually. So to show you what I mean, let me quickly, let me just edit the HTML very quickly. So for example, if I just quickly type in, I think it's black triangle right. Yeah, so you see there's like an actual symbol that you can use. That was an HTML entity that renders that symbol. So originally I was literally inserting the triangle via the content. And then based on whether the value of aria expanded was true or false, I was then changing whether it was a right pointing triangle or a downwards pointing triangle. I guess just to back up for a second, two things quickly. So HTML entities, because I just mentioned those. An HTML entity is a piece of text that begins with an ampersand and ends with a semicolon. They're frequently used to display reserved characters, which would otherwise be interpreted as HTML code. Yeah, and the one I used was black triangle right. I was just typing that quickly so I could copy it, basically. Anyway, enough rambling. I guess I should mention why I'm doing that, why I'm even bothering to insert the arrow in the first place. So the ARIA authoring practices, which is what these nutrition cards are based on, if we jump to the section about a disclosure, it says, when the controlled content is hidden, the button is often styled as a typical push button with a right pointing arrow or triangle to hint that activating the button will display the content. When the content is visible, the arrow or triangle typically points down. So that's why I'm bothering to include it in the first place. It's just good to stick with people's perception of what a component should look like. It makes your stuff easier to use, basically. But the issue, when I was actually inserting the symbols directly in here in this content property, was that they were being announced by screen readers. So for example, when I had like the triangle pointing to the right, when the screen reader read this label, instead of just reading show, it was reading, so it would say like button right pointing black triangle show. But the triangle is only supposed to be decorative though, isn't it? We don't want it to actually read out that, we don't want it to actually read it out. We just want it to say button show. So the clever thing I'm doing is I'm just inserting a little square, and because it's just cosmetic, it's not real content. It doesn't get read by the screen reader. So the screen reader is just going to say show. I'll demo that in a little bit. So that is awesome. And then I'm using this really cool clip path property, which basically it just lets you set, well, it says here, specifies a clipping path where everything inside the path is visible and everything outside it is clipped out. And that basically just sets it to a triangle. And then depending on whether the ARIA expanded attribute is true or false, it's either a right pointing triangle or a downwards pointing triangle. That's pretty cool. Pretty happy with that. Let's see. A few bits of cleanup I would do now. Firstly, I would move this anonymous function into an actual named function. So let's just do that. Let's say function handle click, and we're going to say, whoops, handle click events. And we're basically just going to take all of that, put that, whoops, in here. And now we can pass that function by name instead. So there's that. It should still work. Cool. And I would also, personally, I would move like these bits of setup that we're doing. I'd probably move those into like a function that initializes the script. So let's go function init, and then we'll say initialize the script. And basically, we're just going to do all of this stuff that we're doing down here, but just give it into a function that does sorry, I'm stumbling with words. Put it into a named function that clearly does one job. So the job of this function is to initialize the script. So we'll say hide the content. Let's indent that. And then we'll say insert the trigger. So we'll do that, and the event listener as well. And now that means at the end, all we have to do is call init. I'm just going to grab that comment again. Initialize the script. It's not entirely necessary, but it just means everything's broken up into a clear function. So, you've got a clear function that creates the trigger, a function that's job is clearly to show content, one that's clearly for hiding content. This function handles click events, and then this function initializes a script. So it just means everywhere you look, there's a clear named function that has one job and does that one job well. Yeah, so that is nice. Oops. I keep saying that. That is nice. That's great. So that's good. God, shut up. Okay, anyway. This is all working now as per the nutrition card. I guess one last thing I'd like to do is I'm just going to open this in VoiceOver in Safari, and we can see what the screen reader experience is like. So let's do that now. Where are we? Sorry. Why is my doc not showing up? For goodness sake. Okay. Safari. Right. I'm going to unplug my headphones quickly. And let's check the volume. That's pretty loud. Let's see. Let's see what happens. Well, I guess I'll test it first by tabbing. Okay. So it works. Let's see what the screen reader experience is like.
VoiceOver on Safari. Show collapsed button. You are currently on a button inside web content. To click this button, press Ctrl Option space. To exit this web area, press Ctrl Option Shift up arrow. Hide expanded button. This content is visible by default. We'll use JavaScript to progressively enhance it into a disclosure. Show/hide component. Hide expanded button. You are currently on a button inside web content. To click this button, press Ctrl Option space. To show collapsed button. VoiceOver off.
Okay, so that all seems to be working nicely. You could see it was announcing the collapsed or expanded state of the button, which is exactly what we want. I'm going to link to everything I've mentioned and the actual demo and the code and everything in the description. Again, this is a new format for me, so sorry if the quality isn't the best. I'm more used to writing blog posts than I am doing video tutorials, but I'm going to hopefully keep getting better with practice. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.